I got to thinking about today, we are going to talk about the corrupt bargain, talk a little bit about John Quincy Adams, and then sort of, I've given myself an outline to try and keep myself on topic because I get so excited about the stories. We're going to talk about Andrew Jackson, and then we're going to try and hit Martin Van Buren quickly, which is lucky since he only serves one term anyway. It dawned on me that I think most people know so much about John Adams, founding father, president, but we tend to know less about John Quincy Adams. So I'm going to do a real quick synopsis of what happens in 1824 with the corrupt bargain. And that's the fact that in the election in 1824, John Quincy Adams, who had served as Secretary of State for 2 terms under James Monroe, was sort of the designated person who was going to run for the presidency. You know, we've had a dynasty of Virginia where that we had, out of the original founding fathers who were elected presidents, we had Washington, then Adams, who is from Massachusetts. Then we'd had Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and then John Quincy Adams, of course, back to Massachusetts, son of the former president. And as Secretary of State, he had been an absolutely tremendous Secretary of State. I did want to talk a little bit about his background because I think we tend to sort of see him just as his father's son and not realize that he actually was quite a cerebral, quite a talented man in his own rights. He just unfortunately took on the wrong opponent. He wins the presidential election in 1824 in a race where there were 4 presidential candidates, and that always creates all sorts of havoc. And in doing so, in that election, William Crawford, Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson are running for campaign. And what happens is Andrew Jackson wins the popular vote, but does not have enough of the electoral vote to win the election. It's thrown into the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, Henry Clay from Kentucky, Jackson from Tennessee, Adams from Massachusetts, but Henry Clay throws his support to John Quincy Adams, and John Quincy Adams becomes president. Jackson feels very strongly that it is an elitist move, that, you know, the old insiders have in a corrupt bargain stolen the presidency from a man on the frontier, and in return, John Quincy Adams becomes president, Henry Clay becomes Secretary of State, and that's all the proof that Jackson needed to realize the election had been stolen from him. Now, it's unfortunate because John Quincy Adams had a really unique background. He's born in 1767. 1777, you know, John Adams is already a well-known national figure in the American colonies by 1777. He's been on the Declaration Committee in 1776. 1777, the colonial government sends him to Europe to drum up support for the colonists in the American Revolution, and he takes with him 10-year-old John Quincy Adams. So John Quincy Adams, for the next, from 1779 until 1788, John Quincy Adams is in Europe pretty much that entire time. He will be with his father when the peace treaty is negotiated in 1783. They will at different times be posted in the Netherlands. They will be in Russia. They will be in France. You know, he's growing up serving as his father's secretary on all of these diplomatic missions. And it's a fascinating way to think about a young boy in his teens. Of course, we grew up much quicker in those days, but a young boy in his teens serving as secretary to his father, being there as an eyewitness to what's going on in history. By 1790, he has studied for the bar, passed the bar, and he's a practicing attorney. 1794, President Washington sends John Quincy Adams as his minister to the Netherlands. So he is a diplomat very early on. By 1803, well, actually 1797, his dad sends him to Prussia. Then in 1803, he's elected to the US Senate. Now, in an interesting turn, you'll remember that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, huge fight over the presidency in 1800. It's a really nasty campaign. Jefferson wins. John Adams serves only one term, goes home to Massachusetts, and there's a bitterness between them that exist until 1818 when they finally come back together as friends and buddies and begin their exchange of letters. John Quincy Adams is appointed by the Massachusetts Senate or by the Massachusetts legislatures to represent the state in the U.S. Senate. Back at that point, senators were chosen by state general assemblies. He gets to Washington and he becomes a supporter of Thomas Jefferson. He really believes in Jefferson's ideas, the Louisiana Purchase, a lot of what he sees Jefferson doing from an economic standpoint. He favors Jefferson's support of France because he sees France as the strongest power on the continent at that point. And he becomes such a strong supporter of Jefferson that when it comes time to renew his appointment to the U.S. Senate, the Massachusetts legislature doesn't reappoint him. And so he comes out. But in 1809, Madison sends him as the U.S. ambassador to Russia. He will be there for a period of time. He will come back to the U.S. in 1815. He is sent to the Netherlands to negotiate the peace treaty ending the War of 1812. He is the chairman of that delegation that goes to negotiate the peace treaty. And then when James Madison is no longer steps down, James Monroe runs for the presidency in 1816. And when he's elected, then he, of course, makes John Quincy Adams his Secretary of State because he looks at the Secretary of State as being that person who has the greatest amount of knowledge of international affairs. Historically, that's what the Secretary of State does. John Quincy Adams certainly has the credentials, and I will tell you that he was an absolutely fabulous Secretary of State. We think about the Monroe Doctrine, we think about the Adams-Onis Treaty, which gets us Florida and expands a lot of the boundaries toward the Pacific coming out of that Louisiana Purchase. All of that is John Quincy Adams. Then he's elected president in that corrupt bargain, and it's just not pretty from that point on. Jackson did not come home to Tennessee and just go, oh, well, shucky darn, I lost the election. It's going to be okay. John Quincy Adams is a good guy. He's sort of an in-between the old-fashioned Federalist and the Democratic Republicans that Jefferson had championed. Jackson is concentrating on one thing only, and that's that all of those, what he calls blue blood insiders, have shafted basically someone who is a man of the people. And John Quincy Adams is never really able to overcome that. So, what's important that happens during his presidency? Adams will, because Henry Clay is his Secretary of State, he supports Henry Clay's American system. And the American system was probably the first really strong economic plan for the new states, and we're still relatively new at that point. It was this idea of building an American marketplace where Americans would buy American goods, every state, every city connected. Now we have a common currency that we're the United States. Now we're going to be connected by roads, by railroads, by canals, all of that infrastructure that needs to be built to allow us to trade internally, to become strong and to become cohesive. And John Quincy Adams will support the American system. He's very supportive of Henry Clay, and he sees economics as the way to build our strength to make us a competitor on the world market. And that's where John Quincy Adams, who has this knowledge of Europe from the Western boundaries in France and Britain and the Netherlands, all the way to the Eastern boundaries in Russia, he understands the economy and how we can compete. So he really, really pushes for that. The problem is, in pushing for all of that, he doesn't really have a lot of congressional allies. He has those who are supporters of Jackson. Many of those who are from the South feel disenfranchised by what they believe is a stolen election. He doesn't spend a lot of time even building connections with his own political constituency. Where his father understood how politics worked, John Quincy Adams really was a little more into the book sort of president. And if it needs to be done, it needs to be done. And you shouldn't have to to have all of these breakfasts and luncheons and all of this stuff, persuading people to vote. People should vote because it's the right thing to do. He's a one-term president because he doesn't have a tremendous amount of support. Probably the death knell for Adams is, as he's looking at the economy, he decides that one of the things, if he's going to build the American economy and get American goods to be what our own people purchase first, buy American first, comes out of John Quincy Adams. It's the first time you hear that slogan. And we're going to compete on the international market. He sets up, not the first time in our history, but he creates and pushes through Congress, is able to do a tariff in 1828 that that John Calhoun of South Carolina will dub to be the tariff of abomination, because Calhoun sees any tariff as a way of punishing the South, because the South has less industrialization. The South is more agrarian, and therefore we buy in the South more manufactured goods. So while it's protecting the sale of New England and mid-Atlantic state goods, it's a punishment, he believes, on the South. So when John Quincy Adams is up for re-election in 1828, it comes to as no surprise to anyone that Andrew Jackson is the opponent in that presidential election, and Jackson wins the election 2-1 over John Quincy Adams. Now, before we leave Adams, I have to tell you this, though, because John Quincy Adams is fascinating. He leaves the presidency in 1828, and he doesn't go away either. He goes back to Massachusetts. He will be elected to Congress as the U.S. representative. A delegation comes to him, and I love this story. This delegation comes to him and says, you know, you're the former president, you understand Washington, you have this national perspective, you have domestic policy experience, you have foreign policy experience, we want you to serve in Congress. And Adams says, I will entertain being a candidate for U.S. Congress on 2 conditions. One, I'm not going to campaign, which is that carryover from when he was president and wouldn't work with Congress. He doesn't want to go places and speak to groups. He doesn't want to have breakfast with a bunch of strangers. He said, I'm not going to campaign, and I'm going to vote my conscience on every issue. I'm not going to follow a particular party line, although, they sort of know he's sort of in the middle of the road. He today would be a moderate in many cases. And he says, I'm going to vote my conscience. And if you all don't like that, go find yourselves another candidate. And they agree to it. He is elected to the U.S. Congress in 1828, and he will serve until 1848. Now, he becomes a champion against slavery. He becomes quite an eloquent speaker. In fact, he earns the nickname on the floor of the U.S. House of Old Man Eloquent. Old Man Eloquent, I guess, because he's in his late 60s. Makes me feel kind of pitiful to think he's old man eloquent in his late 60s. But his speeches are wonderful. Sometime if you're bored, Google some of John Quincy Adams' speeches about slavery. You may also have seen the movie Amistad, because when there is an uprising of Africans who are captured to be sold in slavery, and they rise up and they overpower the ship's captain and they take control, they're going to be tried. And John Quincy Adams, after the presidency, of course, steps forward using his legal background, and he will defend them on their right to fight for their freedom. I mean, he's a fascinating character. The other thing that I would tell you about John Quincy Adams is that he began keeping a diary in 1779, and he wrote in his diary every day until 2 weeks before he died in 1848. It is one of the best, from his perspectives, one of the best sources of what was happening nationally and internationally, because he's such an acute observer that it's fascinating to look at. By the way, he will die in 1848 in the midst of making a speech on the floor of the U.S. Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives. He will be in the middle of the speech. He will be stricken. We know now, probably heart attack or cerebral hemorrhage, collapses on the floor, dies 2 days later. So John Quincy Adams is a pretty fascinating guy to take a look at. no less fascinating is Andrew Jackson. And those of you that have been with me before when I've talked about Jackson, Jackson is one of those presidents that you love to hate, but you also love to love, because he's just such a mixture of emotions and actions. You look at him, in his farewell address, and I always love to talk about this, in his farewell address, what he says, and I want to read you the quote. He says, "You must remember, my fellow citizens, eternal vigilance by the people is the price of liberty, and that you must pay that price if you wish to secure the blessing." So, Jackson sees himself as a protector of individual liberties, and in many cases, in his mind, the protection of the Union. And yet he will make political choices that we look at and shake our head and say, here's this protector of individual liberties, this supporter of the Union. How could he make that decision? And that's because I think with Jackson, he's not easy to pinpoint. Part of that is probably because, and many of you know the story, but Jackson grows up and, it's a poor family. I mean, poverty-stricken family. Father dies early, mother who becomes active during the time of the American Revolution in negotiating peace and securing soldiers to be brought back home from Waxhaw, from the district that they live in. He loses two brothers in the American Revolution. His mother dies after having negotiated Carolinian prisoners of war to be released by the British and allowed to come home. And Jackson finds himself as an orphan in his early teens. He is literally the common man on the frontier. He is considered to be the founder of the Democratic Party. Jefferson had been the Democratic Republican Party. He then will extrapolate that to be just the Democratic Party. He's an interesting person. He's the first candidate to talk about being an outsider. Today we hear that conversation all the time. Well, I'm from outside the Beltway and therefore I'll be able to evoke change in Washington, D.C. Well, it's interesting to be an outsider as early as 1828, but Jackson is that. Jackson is also, he's just an interesting character. I mean, he has this high temper, a history of dueling. One of his most famous duels with Charles Dickinson, which occurs in 1806, early on, and he and Dickinson meet in a duel. Dickinson fires at him, strikes Jackson in the chest. Jackson, according to the observers, never even blinks an eye. And he brings his gun down, levels it, and he shoots Dickinson and kills him. Jackson will carry that bullet in his chest the rest of his life. And yet he doesn't even acknowledge he's been shot until after he has evoked the revenge for something Dickinson had said about Rachel. The other duel that's probably most famous that doesn't happen, but it gets really close to happening, is, Jackson, if you look at Jackson's background, he was the first U.S. representative from the state of Tennessee. He will eventually be appointed to the U.S. Senate. He'll resign from the Senate to come home to be a judge in Tennessee's Superior Court. He was anxious to be back in Tennessee. He and John Sevier will get into a fight over who's going to be the commander-in-chief of the Tennessee militia. John Sevier, now the history of the champion of the American Civil War, Battle of Kings Mountain, or the American Revolution, Battle of Kings Mountain, first governor of Tennessee. Jackson gets the appointment, but he and Sevier are constantly in arguments, and Jackson challenges John Sevier to a duel. They go out toward Lebanon, Tennessee, and they're going to meet, and then at the last minute, the duel is called off. But, Jackson just has this reputation of being, you just didn't want to mess with Jackson. He had a quick temper and he didn't mind taking chances. When you think about it, after he becomes commander of the Tennessee militia, of course, then as the War of 1812 occurs, Jackson, by that point, the Tennessee militia is activated, the Tennessee volunteers respond to the call. They asked for something like 3,000, and Tennessee sends 33,000 volunteers. Jackson, of course, is involved in the wars with the Creek Indians, but he gains national notoriety and national acclaim because of the Battle of New Orleans, which occurs in January of 1815. And then he becomes, involved in the acquisition of Florida. He just becomes this national figure. And he bills himself, and it's quite true, by the time that he runs for the presidency, Jackson's a wealthy man. Anyone who's been to the Hermitage outside of Nashville, Tennessee, that is not the home of a poor farm boy from the Carolinas or a poor farm boy in Tennessee. That's a lovely, lovely, home, especially for that period of time in history. But Jackson sees himself as, he calls himself a bootstraps politician, that he's someone who's come from poverty. So first election stolen from him, the 1828 election he wins, and Jackson comes into the presidency as a reformer. He sees himself as, he believes that the government has, those who serve in the government, those who have been appointed by previous presidents, that a lot of them have become, his words are, lazy, corrupt, and they have become soft. And soft was, for Jackson, known as Old Hickory for how hard and tough he is. Soft was one of the worst things that he could use as a way to characterize someone. He believed that he needed to sweep out all of those old political appointees. He will operate under the idea that a new president coming in should be able to choose those who are going to work for him. And of course, he will sort of, in sweeping removal of people all across government, throw people out and replace them with his appointees. When someone in Congress talks about how wrong that is, that a lot of those people had not necessarily done anything wrong, one of his supporters, a senator from New York by the name of Marcy, will get up and say, to the victor belongs the spoils. And what Jackson had done becomes known as the spoil system, and that is the ability of incoming presidents to bring with them their own loyal staff. Now, what do you need to remember about the Jackson presidency? Well, very quickly, I'll mention the Indian removal. Jackson sees himself as reforming. He sees himself as removing corruption. He sees himself as, and it's an interesting situation, he sees himself as strengthening the Union, but at the same time, enhancing the power of sovereignty of states. He's one of the first presidents that you're going to hear that's going to talk about a sovereign nation of sovereign states. Now, exactly how that works, Jackson hasn't figured all of it out, but he wants there to be this, if federalism is going to work and federalism is a balance of power, then there has to be literally a balance of power. So you have to have strong states, you have to have a strong federal government. And that's going to be his justification for the Indian removal. He sees it, we know from what he writes, what he writes and what he thinks may not exactly be the same, but he sees it, he sees the issue of Indian removal as a conflict between tribal status and state authority. And his justification all the way through, and I have mentioned before in classes, he and Chief John Ross had fought together at Horseshoe Bend, along with Major Ridge and numbers of the other Cherokee leaders. And yet, when it comes to the Cherokee removal here in Southeast Tennessee, Jackson refuses to get involved. He not only refuses to get involved, but he actually will step in and push legislation through Congress, through the Democratic Party with their majority, that allows him to come up with the money to buy the Cherokee land, to purchase lands beyond the Mississippi, and then to pay for the removal, the supplies, all those sorts of things. He will justify it in that if that doesn't happen, there's going to be conflict, there'll be bloodshed, and he is actually attempting to save the Cherokee by removing them from a contemptuous, possibly horrible outbreak of conflict that will occur, especially in Georgia, the Carolinas, and Eastern Tennessee. That's probably true. The truth of the matter is also, though, that Jackson will personally make some money on some of those lands that will be taken from the Cherokee and then will be up for claim, especially outside of Muscle Shoals, some of the Creek Indian lands. He didn't try to purchase and then levy those purchases much to Cherokee land, but he certainly did with the Creek land. So those removal treaties, interestingly, if you read the language in the removal treaties, the language is pretty fair. You know, the price that was paid for the land was above what the national standard selling acreage of land was at that point. The problem is the execution of removal really was horrific. I mean, it just was bad. You know, contracts were let out to private individuals, and there was a tremendous amount of corruption. There was a lot of fraud. And I mean, we know that ultimately 1 out of 4 of the Cherokee in particular will die while they are on that trail, whether they are going by boat, as they will part of the way, or whether they are doing the entire overland trail. That's probably the most negative thing in the Jackson presidency. But there are a number of other things that it's kind of interesting to just think about, and to think, I always like to look at them and think about Jackson's motivation. I'm intrigued so often in history by not just the what's, but why. Why do people act the way they act? And the truth of the matter is, political figures like all of us carry with them certain predispositions based on our own experiences. I remember someone referring to it one time like we carry monkeys on our back and we have to feed those monkeys unless we're really well aware and we can somehow snatch the monkeys off our back. So one of the things that John Quincy Adams, I mentioned, had really supported the American system, that expansion of canals, the Erie Canal. You know, I'm probably the only person old enough to remember when we actually used to sing about the Erie Canal. But those road systems and everything. And Jackson, who's a frontiersman, who roads in particular will, you know, would actually help Tennessee, would help the South, would help the nation. Jackson's going to come out, the major land bill that will occur early in his presidency will be the Maysville Road Act. And it would have expanded the national road across the mountains into Kentucky and then westward that way. And Jackson will come out in opposition to it. But it's interesting when you look at it, it's going into Kentucky. The Maysville Road Bill strongest supporter is Henry Clay. Henry Clay is from Kentucky. Andrew Jackson is from Tennessee. They are next door neighbors. They should sort of be united by purpose. But once Jackson is aggrieved with someone, he didn't have a real good, okay, I know you're sorry, we will make up and we will be friends. He vetoes it in many cases simply because Henry Clay is supporting it, and he will take a position that, you know, he's a little concerned with what he sees. They didn't have the word inflation at that point, but he believes prices are driving up, and he believes that the United States government, because it is funded by the people, should return to a simple, frugal, sort of minimalist government. And he uses Jefferson's justification for doing that. He's actually going to call on Jefferson a lot of times. So while they may disagree with certain aspects of what the Democratic or the Democratic Republican Party ought to look like within a Republican form of government, a modified democracy, he will use Jefferson at times to support. Jefferson is the one founding father insider that he looks at and says, but he's not an elitist. Jefferson always identified himself with the yeoman farmer, you know, sort of the working class of farmers. One of the other major conflicts that will come along is that there will become this tremendous conflict over tariffs. Remember that I mentioned a while ago that South Carolina in particular, led by John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun is Jackson's vice president, and they will come into argument over this tariff that will help support, in Jackson's mind, Jackson's not a big tariff person, but he believes in having a tariff, and he has a lower tariff during his presidency in 1832. The new tariff bill will be lower than that one of 1828, but he believes there needs to be some sort of a tariff because he really doesn't like the British. He really doesn't like the British because of that whole history in the American Revolution, the loss of his family, the War of 1812. And so he's supportive of a modified tariff. His vice president is not. Jackson will refer to the tariff in some ways as being a tax, but he doesn't take it to the strong stance that John C. Calhoun will. And Calhoun says that the tariff is nothing more than a hidden tax on Southerners. And it's not just that it's a hidden tax, but Calhoun will come out with the ideal of nullification yet once again. Now, nullification had been advocated by Jefferson and Madison during Jefferson's presidency. Actually, with the Kentucky resolves and the Virginia resolves, when there was a question of national legislation that seemed to be contrary to the state interest, they had both come out with the idea that a state could nullify federal law. It was not ever practiced, but it was there in political philosophy. Calhoun will sort of dig Jefferson back up because Jackson's been quoting Jefferson and will say, South Carolina not only is considering nullifying this tariff, but also we may take up arms if the federal government attempts to collect the tariff in the South Carolina ports at Charleston and into Georgia and Savannah. It all comes to a head at the Jefferson dinner in 1832, and Jackson, in delivering the toast, stands up and with his glass, he says, "Our Union, it must and shall be preserved." And everybody goes, yay, and they drink their drink. And then Calhoun stands up and says, "The Union next to our liberties most dear." And there's sort of the silence because this is a president and a vice president who are at odds over the question of union, which is more important, the federal government or states' rights. And it's beginning, the real true beginning of that division that we will see lead us on until we get to the American Civil War. It comes to a head even more with something that's called the Eaton Affair. And the Eaton Affair, there's always been these stories in politics that are sort of risque and I don't even know if risque is the right word as much as it's just gossip and everything. So Andrew Jackson, Secretary of War, John Henry Eaton, had married a widow in Washington, D.C., Margaret O'Neill, whose mother ran a boarding house. So she's working class family. She had been married once before. Her husband had died while on assignment in Europe. And, so now John Henry Eaton marries her. He's Secretary of War. She now is one of the cabinet wives. And Jackson had a habit of inviting the cabinet at least every couple of weeks to the White House. Remember, he's alone. Rachel's died before he takes the presidency. His daughter-in-law, Emily Tennessee Donaldson, is his hostess. And Jackson likes to have people in. He's a little bit lonely. Well, they always would get together and have dinner, and then the men would go off with their drinks and the cigars to the room to talk politics, and the women would all go off to a room and they would have tea or whatever. The women of the cabinet, because Peggy Eaton, there was some, had her husband died of a heart attack because he found out she was fooling around with Eaton. No evidence of that at all. Was it because her mother ran a boarding house? But the ladies would all go into the drawing room and they would set their chairs in a circle, and they would not allow Peggy Eaton to sit in the circle. She had to sit over on a chair away from everybody else. Talk about mean girls. I mean, that's just mean girls. Well, Jackson hears about it. It happens 3 or 4 times. Peggy Eaton, of course, tells her husband. John Henry Eaton is writing a biography of Jackson. He's Jackson's Secretary of War, so they are friends. And Eaton says to Jackson, here's what's going on. Here's how they're all treating my wife. What should I do? Well, Jackson is furious because Jackson had adored his wife, Rachel. Jackson felt that her death was an early death because of the gossip, because of the way the mean people had treated Rachel Donaldson Jackson. And he really, really gets upset. The women who were circling their chairs were being led, as he begins to kind of investigate what's going on, were being led by Mrs. Calhoun. Now, in all fairness, Emily Tennessee Donaldson, who is his hostess, also did not like Peggy Eaton, and she's part of that circle. But Jackson is absolutely furious, and Jackson writes beautifully, by the way. For a frontiersman, everybody thinks he, was a semi-illiterate. No, he's not. He was a beautiful writer. Jackson writes a series of beautiful and incredibly hostile letters to his vice president, basically saying, how dare you treat this young woman in this way? How dare you allow your wife? Can you not manage your own household? I mean, the kind of thing. And of course, Calhoun and Jackson become, they just sort of separate. And the Calhoun stopped coming to the dinners. The dinners sort of end. Eaton, of course, stays as Secretary of War, but it's this whole split that occurs within the cabinet. Eaton then decides that he and the one ally that he has, Martin Van Buren, who is vice president, or at that point, no, not vice president, he is Secretary of State. They decide to resign from the cabinet, which then sets a precedent. Jackson basically fires everybody in the cabinet. But Martin Van Buren becomes Jackson's buddy, and he sends Martin Van Buren off to be ambassador in England. Election comes up in 1832, and Jackson does not choose Calhoun to be his vice presidential running mate. Instead, he chooses Martin Van Buren. John C. Calhoun will go home to South Carolina and promptly be elected to the U.S. Senate. So he gets rid of Calhoun in the White House and instead now has to deal with him in the U.S. Senate. Tariff of 1832 comes up in the Senate. It actually had reduced the rates, but John C. Calhoun, almost every other state was happy with the changes, but not South Carolina. South Carolina, John C. Calhoun will make a speech on the floor of the U.S. Senate in which he quotes Dante and says, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter. South Carolina is now living in hell." And he sort of says, if this tariff goes into effect, South Carolina is considering withdrawing from the Union. We will defend, and if federal troops come our way, we will defend ourselves against incursion. That's his quote from the floor. Well, talk about premonition of what the American Civil War is going to be like. That's him talking. Well, Jackson responds, interestingly, by asking Congress to reduce the rate of the tariff. And they do, but he also says, but we'll reduce the rate of the tariff, but we're going to enforce its collection. And he, in a speech, says, perhaps it will be necessary for federal forces to march on South Carolina and hang John C. Calhoun from a tree. That's not a real subtle thing, but in effect, what Jackson is going to do is come back and accuse Calhoun of treason, because he says disunion by force is treason. Any attempt to take control of the federal government from a state level or by an individual is treason. And so Calhoun, he is done. Calhoun and Henry Clay will sort of ally to create a tariff that will decrease annually for 9 years, and then it'll be gone away. And the tariff issue will calm down for a period of time. Another major issue, I'm watching the clock, another major issue, the Bank of the U.S. The Bank of the U.S. had been created by Hamilton during the time of Washington's presidency, and it basically had been created to handle the debt of the United States, to manage the flow of money between the state chartered banks, sort of as a a national control over banks and interest rates, in effect, sort of an early Fed, but not quite so well defined. It had been designed so that the charter would expire in 1811, and it did. So the first Bank of the United States disappeared, but the tremendous amount of debt that was incurred for the War of 1812 made it necessary to recharter the second Bank of the United States in 1816 during the end of the Madison, beginning of the Monroe presidency. And it took a little bit of time, but a guy by the name of Nicholas Biddle, you may have heard that name, will take over the second bank. And Biddle will actually in the 1820s be able to sort of bring the bank to a period that it is solvent. He manages the funds appropriately, and they anticipate that the bank, which will then be up to its charter, is going to expire in the early 1830s, that the bank will automatically be renewed. Jackson, much to the surprise of Biddle and those in Congress and everything, will decide that he's not going to sign off on the new charter bill for the bank. His justification, and he quotes Jefferson on it, Jefferson had been opposed to the creation of the first bank when Hamilton suggested it. His argument is going to be that the Bank of the United States, as a national bank controlling the money, was in direct competition with state chartered banks, and it was too much federal involvement in competition with private free enterprise, and that it was much better to not have one bank that could control everything. It's a form of monopoly, but instead to allow the individual state banks to compete with each other. And he announces that he's not going to re-sign it. Well, Clay and Calhoun get together with Biddle and suggest that Biddle try to push through a charter for the Bank of the United States, what would have been the third Bank of the United States. And because they believe that Jackson would not be willing to potentially divide his supporters by not signing the piece of legislation. They push it through Congress and Jackson vetoes it. He just says it's not the right thing for the nation. You know, too much national control. There has to be a balance, back to that idea of federalism. The last major thing really that occurs in the Jackson presidency domestically is that there's not a lot of debate. If you go back and you look at the history books, you look at legislation on the floor of Congress, you look at speeches in Congress, there's not a lot of talk about slavery between 1828 and 1836. It's kind of fascinating when you think about it. And that's because Congress had imposed upon themselves gag rules that they would evoke anytime someone brought up the issue of slavery. And it was almost as though the issue of slavery is such a divisive issue that if we don't talk about it, we're just going to pretend it doesn't exist. Of course, you know, that's not the way to deal with an issue that certainly is dividing the nation. We had dealt with the Missouri Compromise in 1820, the Tariff of Abomination, and South Carolina's strong opposition to that tariff and the 1832 tariff and the whole issue of states' rights. Much of that centered around the issue of slavery. But there's really, you can't find much of a record of discussion about slavery during that entire time. Now, excuse me, abolitionists begin to tool up in the 1830s. There will be pamphlets printed. There will be letters that will be sent out to state legislatures, to churches, to synagogues, you know, trying to get civic, religious, all sorts of groups to become more abolitionists. And the U.S. Postmaster, who sits on the cabinet at that point of Andrew Jackson, will allow postal employees to intercept those pamphlets and letters, and they will be destroyed. They will not be delivered. And Jackson does not take any action against his U.S. Postmaster. He does, however, interestingly, in that farewell address that I quoted at the beginning, will warn in his farewell address that sectional, what he calls fanaticism, will be the death of the republic. And in his mind, we know from having read his notes, he sees the danger as being South Carolina. It's John C. Calhoun, it is South Carolina. The majority of the South is more moderate in his mind. It is South Carolina is the tail that wags the dog, is what he thinks. Foreign policy during the Jackson administration, really not, there's not a lot of foreign policy issues. The one thing that we know from Jackson's notes of a foreign policy nature that he's concerned about, and that's Texas and Mexico. And he will be very quietly and almost secretively supportive of Sam Houston, his buddy from Tennessee, who had been governor of Tennessee, U.S. Senator from Tennessee. He is very supportive of Houston's role in helping lead the Texas Revolution. You know, Houston, Fannin, Davy Crockett, you know, there's so many that were people that Jackson knew that he is supportive of the Texas Revolution. He thinks that is necessary. He wants that boundary secured between Tennessee and Mexico, and yet he is politically smart enough that once Texas independence is won, that he actually pushes and says, but we're not going to talk about Texas as an admission to the Union. He knew that if Texas came into the Union and it upset that balance of slave state versus free state, he thought it was too volatile of a time period. There were too many other issues going on, and he simply, you know, was not going to deal with that. He just did not want to have to deal with that. He wanted to leave it a little bit later. He will leave the presidency in 1836, and his vice president, Martin Van Buren, Little Knickerbocker from New York, will run for the presidency and will be elected as president. Interestingly enough, in doing so, he serves one term only. Martin Van Buren himself is a moderate. He is not able to get out of the shadow of Jackson. There is an economic downturn, a recession that occurs in 1838, 1839, and Van Buren is seen as not having taken enough action to sort of stabilize the economy. And in the election of 1840, much to Jackson's surprise, we know from Jackson's notes, William Henry Harrison, who is the old frontier fighter, is elected president, and Jackson is absolutely dismayed. Of course, William Henry Harrison, you know, that's such a footnote for Martin Van Buren, bless his heart. I mean, he's president and he gets 2.5 minutes, but not a lot happens during his presidency, and he will go back to New York. William Henry Harrison becomes president for 1 month, and then he will die, and John Tyler from Virginia becomes president. And Jackson, who is still a political force to be dealt with, is not happy with what John Tyler is doing in the presidency. And as they begin to look at the election of 1844, Jackson will tap his protege, someone who had worked with him in the court system, someone who he had worked very closely with in sort of honing his political skill. He'll tap John K. Polk, James K. Polk, James Knox Polk, who at that time is Speaker of the House of Representatives. And Polk will become a dark horse candidate who will win the balloting within the party and will be elected in 1844. So Jackson, of course, will live, and he will push the Polk presidency. He will live to see James K. Polk elected to the presidency, and then he will die about 6 weeks after the inauguration, and he will be buried, of course, at the Hermitage next to his beloved Rachel. It's an interesting period of time because you see economic growth, you see that widening conflict based on sectionalism between the South, predominantly South Carolina, with the rest of the Union. You see this pattern being created of outsiders versus insiders, common man. You know, when Jackson is elected president in 1828, one of the things he does is he throws open the doors of the White House and he invites anyone who wants to come to the White House to come. And during that inaugural fortnight, the 2 weeks of the inauguration, people come from all over the country and they just come through the White House. People ride their horses into the White House. I mean, it was absolute havoc. And of course, Washington establishment are looking and they're going, oh my gosh, it's sort of like the hillbillies have come to town, you know, and yet Jackson's not a hillbilly. Jackson is, and you can look at the Hermitage and see Jackson is a man of refinement, but he's a frontiersman and he hasn't forgotten the roots from which he came. And he will be that champion of the common man, Jacksonian democracy. Everyone should have the vote. It shouldn't be based on property, all the sorts of things that you will begin to see occurring. And it's a very interesting time period in American history. It sets us up for what will happen in the 1840s and the 1850s, leading us toward the American Civil War. Now, next week, as I look at the clock, next week when we come back, we're not going to talk about politics. Yes.
We've got at least 2 questions in the chat.
Yay.
And the first, I'm just going to bring them up real quick. The first one was right at the beginning, and it was asked, at end of lecture, please tell us how to find the lecture on Jefferson. We cannot find it online.
And I'm looking at you because I'm assuming maybe it hasn't been posted yet. I don't know. And I could always retape.
Okay.
I love to talk about Jefferson.
All right. I might have misinterpreted that because Suzette posted that if you go to this site and she lists the web address, the programs that have been made public are there. This is the library's YouTube channel. So that might have been in reference to a previous lecture.
And,
so,
and I'm not sure, but you know, I'm always glad to talk a little bit more about Jefferson because I do think he's one of the pivotal figures in our national history. And you know, and like Jackson, he's a complex man. There's not an easy way to categorize Jefferson.
And then the other response was his direct defiance of the Supreme Court publicly supported at the time, or were some as horrified at the time as we are now?
And that's a fabulous question. There were those who were absolutely horrified and appalled, but it's interesting. The strongest opposition to what was occurring with the Cherokee removal and everything really came out of the Northeast, and it came out of predominantly religious communities who saw the removal as the Cherokee, saw it as a political ploy, but it also, they saw it as an inhumane treatment of people. And remember, at this point in history, when the Cherokee removal occurs, the Native American people, the Indians, as they were known at that point in time, were not considered U.S. citizens. Technically, they are U.S. citizens today, but if you are a member of the Cherokee Nation, let's say, for instance, Richard Sneed, who is the principal chief of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee, is a U.S. citizen. He's a U.S. Marine veteran, but they are also a sovereign nation within a sovereign nation. So it's a unique status. But yes, there were people who were appalled. What's really unfortunate is very few people seem to have a strong opinion. There was such a push for land, such a land grab. And in fact, the redisbursement of those lands is called, you know, the Cherokee land grab or the Georgia land grabs predominantly. And there was a justification. I think people, if you go back and you read the newspaper articles, so many of the people were willing to buy Jackson's justification that the Cherokee were actually being saved by moving them westward to Oklahoma. It's sort of like, that may not be, and you can almost see in the editorials and things that people knew that might not be exactly the correct answer, but it's almost like dealing with the issue of slavery. You're averting conflict by pushing it into the future. I mean, there are so many things we look at in history now, and we look back and we go, how did that happen? If you're really interested in the Cherokee question, fabulous book called Jackson Land, all one word, Jackson Land, that looks at just the question of the Cherokee removal. It's written by Steve Inskeep from NPR, but it's a very fair, a very balanced portrayal. He looks at Jackson as that flawed hero. It's absolutely fascinating. I liked it so much that I bought it in paperback, then I bought it on audio, and then I downloaded it on my iPad too, because I refer to it a lot, trying to figure Jackson out. I love complex characters. You know, two-dimensional characters are not nearly as interesting as the complex ones, the Jeffersons, the Jacksons, the Lincolns, others of that nature. The lecture from 11:30, Jefferson and Madison. Okay, I can retape that, and then I can do it privately and then send it to you all if
Check
you all
and
don't
make
have it.
sure we have it. I mean, we send the recordings to a certain person and they are getting them edited and put on YouTube. So I will check with her and see if there was an issue with that one.
Okay.
And we'll let you, we'll have an answer next week. So.
Okay, that sounds good. And I know it's time for us to sign off. Please come back and join me next week, because we're not going to talk politics. We're going to talk social history, religious history, cultural history. We're going to talk about utopianists, transcendentalists, holy rollers, all these great reform movements of the 1840s and the 1850s. And, when today we look out and we go, oh my gosh, tree huggers, granolas, all those things that we use about people that are a little bit different. The 1840s and the 1850s are absolutely fascinating. I love to talk about, Oneida community. My silverware may have been created by utopian society. Of course, here in Tennessee, we have rugby, which was a utopian socialist experiment. I mean, it's just a great period of time to look at all of those other peoples. We're going to talk about other peoples.
Linda.
Yes.
Do you ever sort of publish a list of books that you would recommend with your lectures?
That actually is a great idea. I do oftentimes just mention them, but I don't write them down. I will post for you all some of my favorite Jackson books, especially because I will tell you that John Meacham has a wonderful book on Andrew Jackson, absolutely fabulous. But there are several others that are really great. He's just such an interesting figure. I'll publish a list of those, and I'll go ahead and pull some books and some articles for those of you that might be interested next week to just read about the utopianists and the Shakers, some of those groups who had a tremendous influence on American society, and yet they are sort of outside the norm. They are different sorts of groups, but they're fascinating to look at.
How will we get your list?
Is there a way that we can post it to the website, Jennifer, or?
That is not something I deal with, is anything to do with the website, but I can ask the person who does.
Okay, and if not, then maybe I can give you all my email address, and if you ask me for it, then I can email to you the list and everything.
Well, that's probably the easiest way right now, if you don't mind.
I would love to. Well, my email address is really easy. It's all lowercase, local history counts, COUNTS, no spaces, @gmail.com. And I will encourage you. In fact, I was having this conversation today with a group of people. Keeping local booksellers in business apparently is my place in life. There are people who change the world in other ways. I keep libraries and booksellers happy. I'm going to die and my kids are going to have a tremendous yard sale of all of my books, and I will rain down fire and consume them for doing so. But there's just so many incredible books out there
Right.
And there's so much good research going on now, and wonderful books being published that, you know, you buy a book and it lasts forever. You eat a waffle and it's gone.
Right. Right. Okay. So yeah, local history counts at
At
Gmail.
gmail.com.